Hi, my name's Nina Simon, and I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person today in Frankfurt, but I'm thrilled to get to talk with you a little bit from my home here in Santa Cruz, California, about some of the things I've been playing with around visitor engagement in museums. As many of you know, I run the Museum 2.0 blog, and I'm the author of the book The Participatory Museum. And I focus my work with museums, cultural institutions, and libraries on ways to invite visitors to be active participants in their experience at museums by collaborating with us, partnering with us, and generally contributing their experience and expertise to what we do in our institutions. And I want to focus this 15 minutes just on sharing some thoughts with you on why active participation is so important in museums. And maybe the most basic reason is this: visitors are not passive consumers. They don't walk into our museums as empty vessels waiting to be filled with the knowledge that we give them. Instead, research has shown again and again that visitors come to museums for three reasons: to see things they've never seen before, to do things they can't do anywhere else, and to do those things with their friends and family. When visitors are asked years later to remember museum experiences, they're more likely to remember the people they came with and the way they felt than anything they specifically saw. And again, we see that visitors report positively not only their experience in terms of enjoyment, but also in terms of learning when they're invited to actively do something in the institution. This happens as true in science institutions, certainly, but it's also been shown to be true in art and history museums, that people make a stronger connection with the content when they can actively do something as part of their experience. Now, the second part of this is talking about the idea that museum visitors are not only active, but they're also participants, not just consumers. Now, not every museum has moved towards a participatory model, but more and more are inviting people to share their own story, their own objects, and their own experiences in the museum. And this is particularly important when it comes to thinking about ways to invite people to use new technologies in museums. There's been so much focus on mobile devices and on ways to connect with people in their own homes, online, on their phones, all these places. And I think when we do that, we have to think about the way that people actually use these devices. Nobody uses their phone only to listen, and yet so often in museums we see these devices just as new places to distribute more content. But when I see people using mobile devices in museums, I see them doing things like this, taking photos of their family. Or like this, I was at the Experience Music Project, a rock and roll museum in Seattle, when Michael Jackson died, and they hastily put together this exhibit of the jacket and glove he wore in the Thriller film. And again, for 2 days, people would line up to come take a picture of this object. Now, they were not taking the best picture ever of the most authoritative object. No, instead, they were memorializing their experience. They were identifying themselves as a participant and saying, I was here when this happened. I'm part of this story. And so when we think about connecting with people with technology, we have to think about inviting them not only to listen to what we have to say, but to share back and to use these devices in the active way that they're used to. Now, from a theoretical perspective, the way I like to think about participation in museums is this. A traditional museum is a content provider, whereas a participatory institution is a platform provider. So what's the difference here? Well, in a traditional institution, our job is to make the best, most high quality, accurate, authoritative content we can, and then we push it out equally to all visitors. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD or if you're 10 years old, you're going to get the same label and the same tour, and both are going to be vetted, accurate, and high quality. Now, in this participatory model, the museum focuses less on being the singular voice of authority and more on being a connector, the place where people can share their stories, their unique perspective on a particular incident or event, and those stories and perspectives can be repackaged and made available to visitors as they need them. So if you think about it, there's some people who walk in your doors and they want the long version of the label, and there are other people who want the quick glance. And right now we have to choose one way. But in a participatory model, you can look at each visitor and say, what are you looking for today? What exactly do you want from this experience? And how can I provide that through what everybody else has provided? A lot of people look at this model and it looks very messy. It's frankly kind of scary if you're used to the traditional model. But from my perspective, there's huge benefit to moving in this direction, if only because the cumulative experience of all of the visitors who walk through our doors is unparalleled on staff. I spend time in history museums, and there are constantly visitors coming up to security guards or to the front desk and saying, I was there. I have a story related to this thing that's on your walls. And so often the only way for a museum to receive that is just to nod and say, oh, that's nice. In a participatory model, you can capture those veteran stories, those mothers' stories, those activist stories, and connect them to the people who really want to hear them. There are lots of ways to do this. Here's a simple example from the Oakland Museum of California. This is from their exhibition about the Great Depression of the 1930s. And they decided, since this exhibit opened in the summer of 2010, when we in the US were experiencing another serious recession and what some called a depression, they decided not to put all the walls full of stuff from the 30s, but to, in one big space, invite people to talk about how they're dealing with crisis and how they see an opportunity for the country to move forward now. By inviting visitors to do this, to share their own voice, they're also inviting those visitors to connect with the historical information that's on the walls and to see that history not just as a story about something that happened once, but as a useful, relevant piece of information for the way we're living now and where we're hoping to go in the future. Now, moving to the digital world, there are some museums that have started experimenting with participation online in some really powerful ways. Here's an example from a museum that doesn't exist yet, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, which will open soon to commemorate the bombing of the World Trade Centers. They've started a really interesting online participatory project inviting people to contribute their own stories, photographs, recordings, video, and audio of what happened, authentic accounts of the day. And that means they've been able to collect some material that just isn't collectible from a authoritative content that has to come from a citizen. And then what they did is not just accept this content, but really construct a platform that allows them to push it out in some interesting and novel ways. So for example, they're doing this Google Street View thing where they're lining up historic photographs from the date against the photographs today of the same places. So this is one of those examples where it's not the museum saying, this is a free-for-all, give us whatever you want. It's about the museum inviting contributions, vetting them for accuracy, and then constructing a platform in which they become meaningful. And from my perspective as an exhibit designer, the opportunity to design those platforms, to determine which narratives, which juxtapositions, which connections we're going to make available to people is a really exciting and powerful role to have today. The most powerful participatory projects are those where we can use our expertise and knowledge in-house to enhance, inspire, and encourage visitors to make connections with our content that they might not have ever before. And when I think about designing for participation, I really start with this core question: how can visitors make this museum better? What can they contribute that will help all visitors experience our content in more powerful ways? And how can we design the structure in which that happens? And I want to end by just telling you about one museum that I think is doing this really well, and that's the Minnesota History Center. The Minnesota History Center is the museum for the state of Minnesota, and in 2008, the state was celebrating its 150th birthday, and the museum decided to take that opportunity to redesign their permanent gallery. It used to be called Minnesota A to Z. It would now be Minnesota 150, the 150 things that make Minnesota, Minnesota. And so they started out with a very traditional exhibit design model. They had historians and exhibit developers work together to figure out what these 150 things would be. But they ran into a problem, and the problem came in the form of a bundt pan. Now, I don't know how many of you are bakers, but a bundt pan is one of these pans that's used to make a circular cake. And you may not know this, but it was invented in Minnesota. And there was one woman on the exhibit team, Kate Roberts, who felt really strongly that the bundt pan was one of the 150 things that makes Minnesota, Minnesota. And there were other people on her team who didn't really agree with her. And discussing this, they realized that the reason she felt the bundt pan should be included was not based on her rich historical knowledge, but based on her conviction as a Minnesotan that this was one of those things. And so they decided, you know what? We shouldn't develop this exhibit in-house with our own staff. We should invite people all over the state to let us know what they think makes Minnesota, Minnesota. And so that's what they did. They put out an open call for nominations. They put out a call online using a wiki, but then they also sent letters to historical societies and particular communities all over the state to make sure they got good participation. And when they found that online they weren't getting what they wanted, they got an air-conditioned booth at the Minnesota State Fair, which is a big deal. Lots of people come. And in the end, they ended up with 18,000 nominations. At that point, they closed the door, they said thank you very much, and they sat in a room and arbitrated amongst themselves which of these nominations would make the 150 that would make the final exhibit. Here's a picture of the reopened exhibit. Each one of those stations is one of those 150 items, and each one tells the story from the perspective of the person who nominated it. So for example, this story of 8 bank employees, female bank employees who protested so that they could get equal pay to men was nominated by this woman standing here, and it's her voice, her text, makes the main text of the label. Now, it's also supported by curatorial and expert and historian text and photographs that were provided by the museum. But again, the museum served as a partner, figuring out how to take the visitor's enthusiasm and combine that with historical knowledge and objects to build it into a great exhibit for everybody to enjoy. And the Minnesota 150 exhibit isn't just another nice way to show history. It's also a very specific way for the Minnesota History Center to approach their core mission, which is to connect people with history so they can gain perspective on their lives. From that perspective, passively receiving an exhibit is not necessarily going to achieve the mission in the same way that you can if you ask people to really think about what is that thing that makes our state our state? What about our history is important to me, to you, to everybody around in our community? And I think that for me, participatory techniques, while they're often billed as something new for museums, from my perspective, they're a way for us to achieve something that we've always wanted to do, to help people get excited, get involved, get engaged with our content that we love and already feel so strongly about. So I leave you with this question, and I encourage you over the next couple of days to really think about what visitors can do, not just to have fun, not just to learn something, but to really contribute to and partner with you as you work together to co-create the best museum experiences you can. Good luck, and I hope you have a great few days of discussion. Bye-bye.